The first splash Evan heard wasn't from his line, it was from her paws cutting through the shallow water. Heart pounding, he froze, ready to drop his rod and run. But the bear didn't lunge. She stopped short, watching him with a strange, measured calm, and then turned toward the tree line. She looked back once, as if to say, "Follow me." Against all reason, he did. The river at dawn was Evan Ross's church. He came here for the quiet, for the glassy surface that mirrored the sky before the wind came up, for the way the world seemed to hold its breath while the sun edged over the ridge. He'd been fishing this bend since he was 12, a strip of slow-moving water tucked between mossy banks where the trout held in the shadows. It wasn't a fancy setup, just an old aluminum rowboat tied to a half-buried rock, a battered tackle box, and his father's hand-me-down fly rod. He'd never needed more. That morning, the air was cold enough to numb his fingers. The mist clung low, coiling between the spruces and drifting over the water. The only sounds were the drip of condensation from the trees and the slow glug of the current against the rock. Somewhere upstream, a loon called once, its voice carrying through the fog like a thread. Evan adjusted his footing on the slick stones, stripped a length of line, and let the fly drift lazily downstream. He was already thinking about the coffee in his thermos and the little camp stove in the boat. There was no rush, fishing here was about the hours, not the catch. The first splash was small, off to his right, maybe a trout rising. But the second splash was heavier, more deliberate. He glanced downstream, expecting to see a beaver cutting across the current or maybe a deer testing the shallows. Instead, the fog shifted, and a shape began to form. At first, it was just a blur of motion. Then the mist peeled away, and his chest went tight. A bear, a massive brown, the kind you felt in your gut before your mind caught up. She was in the water, upstream of him, moving slowly but with purpose. The current broke against her shoulders, the ripples fanning out toward him. Her fur was dark and wet halfway up her legs, and each step was measured, unhurried. Evan's first instinct was pure survival. Every nerve screamed move. He could back toward the bank, maybe get to the boat, maybe put the river between them. But something in her manner made him pause. She wasn't huffing or swaying her head the way bears did when warning off a threat. She didn't pin her ears or rush forward. Instead, she stopped in water just deep enough to reach her chest and looked at him. It wasn't a predator's stare, sharp, calculating, but something different. Steady. Almost expectant. Evan's breathing slowed. He kept his rod low, the tip resting against the water, and didn't make a sound. Then, without a growl or any sign of aggression, she turned her head toward the tree line. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if she wanted him to notice. She took 2 steps toward the bank, then stopped, looking back over her shoulder at him. Evan swallowed. "What in the hell?" he murmured under his breath. He knew enough about bears to understand they didn't invite you anywhere. If anything, they wanted you gone. And yet, she wasn't leaving, wasn't disappearing into the trees. She was waiting. The logical part of his brain told him to turn around, pack up, and pretend none of this happened. But another part, quieter and harder to ignore, whispered that this was something he'd never see twice in his life. He found himself stepping toward her. The water was shock-cold against his boots as he waded to the bank. She moved when he moved, climbing out of the river with the ease of something born to it. Her paws left dark prints in the moss, leading him toward the shadowed line of spruces. Every few steps, she glanced back, never hurrying, never letting him close the gap too much. The forest swallowed them quickly, the mist fading as they moved under the canopy. The ground here was soft and uneven, the air rich with the smell of damp earth and pine. Evan's breath came quicker now, not from exertion but from the growing strangeness of it all. He'd heard of bears wandering near campsites, of them following fishermen for the scent of a catch. But this felt different. She didn't circle him or try to block his way. She was leading. After what felt like 10 minutes of walking, they came to a break in the trees where the ground sloped down toward a narrow gully. Water trickled through it from the last rains, feeding into a pool at the base. She stopped at the edge, her body still, her head lowered slightly as if waiting for him to look. Evan's eyes swept the scene. At first, all he saw was mud, water, and the tangle of roots along the banks. Then something pale caught his attention, a flash of color against the brown earth. He moved closer, boots sinking into the wet ground. It was a backpack. Small, faded red, half buried in the mud as if it had been there for weeks. One of the straps was torn, the zipper half open, revealing the corner of a spiral-bound notebook inside. Evan's mouth went dry. He turned to the bear, who hadn't moved from her spot. She was watching him with that same steady, unreadable gaze. "Why'd you bring me here?" he asked, though the answer wouldn't come in words. A breeze moved through the clearing, carrying the scent of wet moss and something else, faint, metallic. He realized suddenly that the gully walls had fresh claw marks, deep and uneven, like something had been digging here recently. The bear blinked once, then turned away, heading back toward the forest. She didn't look back this time. Evan stood there for a long moment, the water in the gully trickling around his boots, his eyes fixed on the red backpack. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Evan crouched beside the red backpack, the damp seeping through the knees of his jeans. Up close, the fabric was more worn than it had looked from a distance, the red dulled to brick, the corners frayed, a smear of dried mud across the front pocket. He tugged gently at the zipper. It stuck halfway, the teeth clogged with grit, but after a careful pull it came free. The notebook inside was waterlogged, its cardboard cover warped. He slid it out, the paper squelching in his hands, and flipped it open as gently as he could. The first pages were a mess, ink bled into gray swirls, words swallowed by the rain. But deeper in, the water damage lessened, and faint handwriting emerged. The letters were small and tight, the kind of neat script you saw from someone who still wrote more than they typed. The first line he could read sent a cold current through him. June 14th, if I don't make it back by tomorrow, it's because I couldn't find the trail again. Evan read on, the words halting in places where the water had blurred them. The writer mentioned camping upriver, looking for a hidden spot where the water fell over a basalt ledge. Then there were notes about food running low, a twisted ankle, and, finally, the sound of something big moving outside the tent at night. The last entry ended mid-sentence. He looked up from the pages. The bear was gone. The forest felt suddenly heavier, the hush pressing in. Evan slid the notebook back into the pack and stood. That faint metallic smell was still in the air, stronger now that he was paying attention. It mingled with the earthy scent of the gully, carried by the trickle of water downstream. He scanned the walls of the gully again. The claw marks weren't random. They were deep, vertical rakes, fresh enough that damp soil still clung to the edges. Whatever had been buried here had been uncovered recently. And not by human hands. A distant splash snapped his head up. It came from the direction of the river, muffled by the trees. He felt the urge to run back, not because of the bear, but because something about this place, about that backpack, made his skin crawl. Still, he took one last look around before retracing his steps. The walk back through the spruce was slower. Every few minutes, he thought he caught movement ahead, a shift of shadow, the quick sway of a branch, but when he focused, it was gone. When the river finally came into view, the mist had thinned, and the sun had climbed high enough to burn gold along the water. His boat was still tied where he'd left it. But there, on the moss beside the rock, lay something new. A fish. A fat rainbow trout, fresh caught and still glistening, its sides flashing pink and silver. Evan's breath caught. He hadn't left his line in the water long enough to catch it earlier, and there was no sign of another fisherman. He scanned the bank, the tree line, the shallow water downstream. Nothing. But somehow, he knew. The bear had left it. For the first time that morning, the knot in his chest eased. He set the fish in the cooler in his boat, then looked upriver where the current bent around a stand of willows. The thought came unbidden, she wanted me to find that pack. Back at the gully, there'd been no sign of the hiker who'd written the notes. No camp gear. No trail leading away. Just the backpack and those deep claw marks. Evan untied the boat, but instead of rowing straight home, he drifted in the current, letting the water carry him while he thought. Part of him wanted to turn the pack over to the sheriff immediately. But he knew how that might play out. A couple of deputies would hike in, see claw marks, and assume an animal attack. They'd write it up as another wilderness tragedy, maybe send a search crew if they were feeling thorough, and that would be the end of it. But the way the bear had approached him, the way she'd led him without aggression, it didn't fit the story of an animal that had killed and buried its prey. And the fish on the bank, that sealed it. No, this was something else. By the time the bend in the river brought his cabin into sight, Evan had made a decision. He'd keep the backpack for now. He'd dry the notebook, see if he could make out more of the writing, and maybe find something that would tell him who had been out there, and what had happened. He hauled the boat onto the bank, slung the pack over his shoulder, and carried it into the cabin. The air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee grounds, familiar and grounding. He set the pack on the table and started a fire in the stove to help dry the pages. When he unzipped the front pocket, he found more, a folded map, stained and creased, with a route marked in red pencil. The trail wound upriver, crossed the ridge, and ended in a small X near what looked like a rock outcropping. Evan traced the route with his finger. He knew that ridge, he'd hunted elk there in the fall. It was rough country, full of basalt cliffs and hidden gullies. Easy to get lost. He set the map aside and opened the notebook again, spreading the pages near the stove. The heat coaxed out the faint smell of river water and earth. Slowly, the ink began to sharpen. One line, near the end, made him pause. Saw her again today. She followed me for an hour. I don't think she wants to hurt me. Evan sat back, the firelight flickering on the words. Whoever had written this had seen the bear too, maybe the same one. And if they hadn't made it out, maybe she was the only one who knew why. Evan woke before the first light, the cabin still wrapped in that deep pre-dawn quiet. The fire in the stove had gone to embers, leaving only the faint smell of wood smoke and the occasional pop of settling logs. He sat at the table with a mug of coffee, the map spread in front of him, the route traced so many times now that his fingertip had smudged the pencil marks. The decision to go had been building all night. By the time he'd turned in, he already knew he wouldn't be able to let it go. Whoever had carried that backpack into the backcountry had left clues, and the bear, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, seemed determined that he should find them. He packed light, a day pack with water, jerky, a first aid kit, a headlamp, and the small .357 he always carried in the bush. Not for the bear, somehow he knew he wouldn't need it for her, but because the mountains could hold other dangers. The sun was still low when he pushed off in the boat, letting the current take him upriver. Mist curled off the surface in ribbons, and the only sound was the rhythmic dip of his oars. At the bend where the willows crowded the bank, he pulled ashore and tied off, just as the map indicated the trail would begin. The path wasn't obvious at first, more a game trail than anything made by human boots, but once he spotted the worn places in the grass, it revealed itself, winding steadily upward. The air grew cooler as he climbed, the scent of river water giving way to pine resin and damp earth. He'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when the sound reached him, the faint crunch of weight on dry needles, keeping pace but off to his right. Evan slowed. The sound slowed. He stopped entirely. Silence. "Guess you already know where we're going," he murmured. A shape moved between the trees, broad shoulders, dark fur catching the shafts of sunlight breaking through the canopy. The bear stepped into view, her head level, her eyes fixed on him with that same unreadable calm he'd seen at the river. Evan felt no urge to lift his gun. Instead, he adjusted his pack and kept walking. She fell in parallel a dozen yards to his right, her pace matching his. The trail grew steeper, skirting the side of a ridge where loose shale made each step a careful calculation. At one point, the path narrowed to a shelf no wider than a boot, with the drop falling away into a tangle of spruce below. Evan moved slow, testing each foothold. The bear, somehow, took it all in stride, her massive paws finding purchase where his boots slipped. After nearly an hour, they reached a high saddle where the trees thinned and the land opened to a view of the valley. The river was a silver ribbon far below, curling through a quilt of autumn gold and evergreen. Evan took a long pull from his water bottle, then checked the map. The X was still a couple miles ahead, past the ridge and into a basin he didn't know well. He'd hunted nearby, but the terrain beyond was wild, broken with cliffs and deep, narrow gullies. The bear moved ahead for the first time, crossing the saddle and slipping into the tree line on the far side. Evan followed, the ground here soft with moss and the air damp with the smell of running water. Somewhere ahead, a creek chattered over stones. The trail, if you could call it that, angled down into a draw. The light dimmed under the canopy, and the temperature dropped a few degrees. Ferns crowded the path, their fronds brushing against his knees. It was in that green half-light that Evan spotted something caught in the crook of a fallen log, a strip of nylon webbing, frayed at the end, the kind used for backpack straps. He pulled it free, the fabric damp but intact, and stuffed it into his pocket. "Was this yours to show me, too?" he asked under his breath. The bear was standing in the middle of the draw, head lifted slightly, nose working the air. She didn't move until he caught up, then continued on without a sound. They came to the creek, shallow but fast, its bed littered with pale stones. Evan crouched to fill his bottle, and that's when he saw the prints in the mud on the opposite bank, human, one set, barefoot, the toes digging deep like someone had waded across in a hurry. The prints led into the ferns, vanishing after a dozen yards. Evan's pulse picked up. Whoever had left them had been here recently. Days, maybe less. The bear waited ahead, her bulk a shadow between the trees. They climbed again, the terrain rougher now, broken with boulders and the twisted roots of old spruce. The map said the X was close, maybe another half-mile. Evan's shoulders ached under the pack straps, but he pushed on, driven by the quiet certainty that whatever he'd come to find was near. When the slope finally leveled, they stepped into a small clearing hemmed in by rock walls. A sheer basalt face rose at the far end, streaked black where water seeped down. At its base, a hollow yawned, not a cave exactly, but a deep recess where the overhang created a pocket of shadow. The bear stopped at the edge of the clearing, not following him in. She settled onto her haunches, watching. Evan approached the recess slowly. The smell hit him first, damp earth, stone, and something faintly metallic, like the scent at the gully where he'd found the backpack. He ducked inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. In the far corner, half hidden under a slab of rock, was a pile of gear, a small tent, collapsed and folded, a sleeping bag still in its stuff sack, and a battered metal canteen. Next to it sat a pair of hiking boots, the leather cracked and stiff. And on top of the boots, a folded piece of paper held in place by a smooth river stone. Evan crouched and lifted the stone. The paper was creased and worn, but dry. Unfolding it, he saw the same neat handwriting from the notebook. "If you find this, I had to move again. She's still following, but I think it's to lead me somewhere. Please, don't be afraid of her." Evan sat back on his heels, the words heavy in his hands. The bear outside hadn't moved. Evan folded the note carefully and slid it into his jacket pocket. The handwriting was as steady as the earlier notebook entries, but something about the way it trailed off at the end, no signature, no date, made his stomach tighten. Whoever had written it had been moving, uncertain, maybe scared, yet still trusted enough to believe the bear meant no harm. He stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, and took another slow look around the recess. The gear was weathered, but not ancient. A thin layer of dust coated the tent fabric, and a few spider webs clung to the boots, but the canteen's metal was clean, almost polished. Someone had handled it not too long ago. A faint sound outside drew his attention, a soft huff, low and steady. Evan stepped out of the overhang into the clearing. The bear was no longer sitting at the edge, she had moved to the far side, toward a narrow split in the rock wall. It was just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways, half hidden by a curtain of ferns. She stood there, glancing back at him once before pushing her massive frame into the gap. Her fur brushed the stone as she squeezed through, vanishing into the shadows beyond. Evan hesitated only a moment before following. The gap opened into a narrow defile, the rock walls climbing high enough to block most of the light. The air was cooler here, damp and still. His boots scraped against stone, echoing in the confined space. The bear moved ahead with surprising silence, her shape filling the passage until it bent sharply to the left. When he rounded the bend, the sight stopped him cold. The defile ended abruptly in a natural amphitheater, a hollow carved by time and water, open to the sky above. In its center was a pool fed by a small cascade trickling down the far wall. Moss carpeted the edges, and the air was rich with the smell of wet stone and cedar. But it wasn't the beauty of the place that froze him. It was the figure lying near the pool's edge. At first, he thought it was a pile of clothes, faded by sun and rain. Then he saw the shape of a shoulder, the angle of a leg. A person, unmoving. The bear stopped several yards short, sitting heavily on her haunches, eyes fixed on him. Evan approached slowly, each step measured. As he drew closer, he saw the figure was a woman, maybe mid-30s, dressed in hiking pants and a long-sleeve shirt. Her hair was tangled, her skin pale under the grime, but her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. She was alive. "Hey," he said softly, crouching beside her. "You hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. She made a faint sound, not quite a word, more a rasp, and shifted weakly. Evan slid his pack off and pulled out his water bottle. Easy now. Small sips. He tipped a bit against her lips, and she swallowed greedily before coughing. Up close, he could see her ankle was badly swollen, the skin stretched and mottled with bruising. That, combined with her condition, told him she'd been here for days at least. He pulled the note from his pocket. "This yours?" Her eyes opened a little wider, and she nodded weakly. "You left it by the boots?" Another nod. He glanced over his shoulder at the bear. She was still sitting, calm as ever, watching. "You followed me here?" This time she managed a faint smile. She stayed. Every night. Evan felt a chill run through him. The way she said it wasn't fear, it was gratitude. "We've got to get you out of here," he said, already scanning the terrain for the easiest way back to the clearing. But the defile was narrow, the ground uneven. Carrying her alone would be slow and dangerous. The woman seemed to read his hesitation. "Don't leave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm not," Evan said. "Just thinking." The bear shifted, rising to her feet. She padded toward the pool, lapped water, then turned back toward the gap they had entered from. She looked at Evan, then at the woman, and rumbled softly, a sound deep enough to vibrate in his chest. Evan didn't pretend to know what it meant, but he had the strange, unshakable feeling she understood more than he could explain. "All right," he muttered, "guess we're doing this together." He helped the woman sit up, draping her arm over his shoulders. She winced, biting back a groan as she put weight on her good leg. They moved in slow increments toward the defile, the bear waiting ahead like a sentinel. Each time they paused, the bear stopped too, looking back until they started again. It took nearly 20 minutes to reach the clearing, and by then Evan's shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the cool air. He lowered her onto a patch of moss and took a long breath. "We'll rest here," he said, checking her ankle again. The bear lingered at the edge of the clearing, gaze flicking between them and the trail leading down the ridge. Evan had the sense she knew the way, maybe even the safest route. When they moved again, she took the lead. The trail wound downward, sometimes so steep Evan had to brace himself against trees to keep from slipping. Through it all, the bear kept a steady pace, never too far ahead, pausing at every bend until they caught up. After an hour, the sound of the river returned, faint at first, then louder until the shimmer of water appeared through the trees. Evan's legs ached from the strain, but the sight of the current gave him a fresh jolt of energy. They broke from the tree-line onto the bank just upstream from where his boat was tied. Evan helped the woman down onto the grass and turned to look for the bear. She was standing a few yards away, her fur haloed by the slanting afternoon light. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then she dipped her head once, almost like a nod, and turned back toward the forest. Evan watched until she vanished among the trees. Evan knelt in the grass beside the woman, her breathing steadier now but her skin still pale beneath the dirt. The river's voice filled the silence, the hiss and rush of water over stone, and the smell of wet pine carried on the wind. He could feel her shiver through the fabric of her shirt. "We're almost there," he said, though they were still miles from the cabin. "Just hang on." She glanced toward the tree line where the bear had disappeared. "She really left?" Evan followed her gaze. "For now." His voice came out quieter than he intended. "But she's been following you for days, hasn't she?" The woman nodded faintly. "Since the second day. I thought she was going to finish me off. And she didn't. She brought me fish once. Dropped it near my camp and left. I couldn't even cook it, but her voice trailed off. She scared off something one night. Heard it moving around. Could have been wolves. Evan looked at her for a long moment, his mind replaying the way the bear had waited at every bend in the trail. What's your name? Mara. All right, Mara. We're going to get you to my cabin. You'll rest, then we'll get you to town. She nodded, but he could see the weight in her eyes, not just exhaustion, but the memory of however many days she'd spent alone in that hidden basin, wondering if anyone would find her. Evan pushed off in the boat, keeping his stroke steady so the ride would be smooth. Mara leaned back against the thwart, eyes half closed, the afternoon light catching the wind-tangled strands of her hair. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun was slipping toward the horizon, painting the water in amber and bronze. Evan tied up, then helped Mara inside. The interior smelled of pine and ash, the wood stove's warmth lingering from the morning fire. He settled her in the old armchair by the stove, draped a blanket over her, and poured a mug of hot water for her to sip. Don't drink too much too fast, he warned. She cupped the mug in both hands, letting the steam warm her face. I didn't think I'd see another person again, she said, her voice rough but stronger than before. Evan sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. What happened out there? She took a slow breath. I came in from the North Ridge. Wanted to photograph the basalt falls, thought I could make a loop back to the trailhead. But the map I had, it didn't show how steep the gullies were. I slipped crossing one. Twisted my ankle bad. Took me hours to get up again. By then I'd lost the trail. And the bear? First night, I heard her in the trees. I thought it was over. She let out a brittle laugh. But she didn't come close. Next morning, I saw her standing by the river. Just looking at me. When I tried to limp downstream, she followed. Why didn't you head toward her? I was scared. But then, second night, something came near camp. I could hear it pacing, snapping branches. She rushed it. Loudest roar I've ever heard. Whatever it was, it ran. After that, I stopped thinking she was there to hurt me. Evan listened, the flicker of the stove casting shadows across the room. You left that note by the boots. I didn't know if I'd make it. Figured if anyone came, they'd at least know she wasn't the enemy. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the pop of the stove. Outside, the light faded to a deep blue, and the wind shifted through the trees. Mara's eyes drifted shut, and her breathing steadied. Evan let her rest. He stepped outside, leaning against the porch rail, scanning the edge of the forest. The night was still, the river's murmur carrying in the distance. Then, movement. A shadow between the trunks, big and deliberate. The bear stood there, barely visible in the gloom, watching the cabin. She didn't move closer, didn't make a sound. Just stood, a silent presence under the dark canopy. Evan felt no fear. Only a strange sense of understanding. He gave a slow nod in the bear's direction. She turned and melted back into the trees. When Evan returned inside, Mara stirred. She's still out there, isn't she? Yeah, he said. And I think she's been out there longer than either of us realize. Mara tilted her head, puzzled. But Evan didn't explain. Not yet. Evan woke before dawn, the cabin dark except for the faint embers in the stove. Outside, the wind had died, leaving an almost unnatural stillness. He eased out of bed and moved quietly so as not to wake Mara, who was still asleep in the armchair, the blanket pulled up to her chin. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of wet leaves and river water. The moon was still hanging low, its pale light spilling over the clearing. That's when he saw them, tracks. They were scattered across the soft ground between the edge of the forest and the side of the cabin. Bare prints, broad and deep, circling the clearing more than once. But mixed among them were others, narrower, longer, the pads elongated like those of a big predator. Evan crouched and traced one with his finger. Wolf. His jaw tightened. The bear hadn't just been watching the cabin, she'd been guarding it. The wolf tracks stayed mostly near the tree-line, never venturing far into the open. It was as if something had kept them from coming closer. Evan followed the tracks toward the riverbank, the mud cold under his boots. At the water's edge, the wolf prints doubled back, vanishing into the underbrush. The bear's prints stopped at the bank, then turned toward the downstream path. She'd patrolled both sides. When he returned to the porch, Mara was awake, the blanket still around her shoulders. "You're up early," she said, her voice hoarse. "Couldn't sleep," Evan replied. He didn't tell her about the wolf tracks just yet, no need to pile on fears she didn't need. Instead, he said, "How's the ankle?" She shifted, wincing slightly. "Better than yesterday." "Still not walking far?" Evan nodded. "We'll give it another day before heading to town." Mara hesitated. "Do you think she's gone?" "The bear?" He thought about the tracks circling the cabin. "No. I think she's close." They spent the day in a slow rhythm. Evan split wood, the sharp crack of the axe echoing across the clearing, while Mara sat by the porch rail, warming her face in the sun. Every so often, she'd glance toward the tree-line. It was mid-afternoon when Mara froze, her gaze fixed on the far edge of the clearing. Evan followed her eyes. The bear was there, half in shadow, her fur lit at the edges by the sun. She didn't move toward them, just stood, watching. Evan set the axe aside and stepped down from the porch, moving slowly so he wouldn't startle her. She didn't back away. "Came to check in," he murmured. The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Then she turned her head slightly, looking toward the slope that led down to the river. Evan frowned. "What is it?" She gave a low, rolling huff and stepped into the trees. Mara leaned forward. "She wants you to follow." Evan hesitated, then grabbed his coat. "Stay here. If anything comes close, get inside and lock the door." The trail she took was faint, almost swallowed by ferns and undergrowth, but the weight of her paws had left fresh depressions in the soil. She moved at a pace just slow enough for him to keep up, glancing back every so often. After about 15 minutes, they reached the riverbank where the current ran shallow over pale stones. Across the water, the wolf tracks were fresh, pressed deep into the mud. But there was more, scattered tufts of dark fur clinging to branches, and a few drops of blood staining the stones. The bear sniffed the ground, then looked at Evan. He studied the scene. Something had happened here, some kind of confrontation. The wolf had been hurt, maybe driven off. "You've been keeping them away," Evan said under his breath. She turned upriver, giving another low huff before stepping into the shallows. The water swirled around her legs as she crossed. On the far bank, she paused, looking back at him one last time before disappearing into the trees. Evan stood there for a long moment, the sound of the river rushing in his ears. Then he turned and made his way back to the cabin. Mara was on the porch when he emerged from the trees. "She left. For now," Evan said. "But she's still watching over us." Mara's eyes softened. Why? Why would she care what happens to me? Evan thought of the gully, the backpack, the note, the way the bear had waited at every turn. Maybe she knows what it's like to be saved, he said quietly. Mara tilted her head. You're speaking from experience. He didn't answer right away. A few years back, I found her caught in a trap near the ridge. Steel jaws clamped around her leg. She was bleeding bad, thrashing. I got the trap open, and she bolted into the woods. Didn't think I'd ever see her again. Mara's eyes widened. And now? Now she's here. They sat in silence as the shadows grew long and the air cooled. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. That night, Evan left the door unlatched, just in case the bear needed to come close. By the third night, the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches against the cabin roof, but beneath it, Evan kept catching faint, intermittent sounds. Mara noticed too. Something's out there, she whispered from the armchair, her voice tight. Evan moved to the window, peering into the darkness. The moon was veiled by thin clouds, throwing the clearing into a patchwork of shifting shadows. At first, nothing moved. Then, just beyond the first row of pines, he caught the gleam of eyes. They weren't alone. Stay here, he murmured. He slipped his rifle from the wall rack and eased out onto the porch. The boards groaned softly under his boots. The eyes were still there, low to the ground, pacing just inside the tree-line. A wolf stepped into the open, its fur thick and dark as coal, its head low. It moved with the confidence of a predator that knew its place. Another pair of eyes appeared behind it. Then another. Evan's grip tightened on the rifle. Wolves in these parts didn't usually approach humans unless desperate or emboldened. The first wolf took a step closer, its muscles bunching beneath its coat. Then, from the left, a deep, rolling roar ripped through the night. The sound hit like a wave, echoing through the trees and freezing the wolves in place. From the shadowed edge of the clearing, the bear emerged. Her massive frame was lit in flashes by the moonlight breaking through the clouds, her scarred muzzle glinting wet. She stood broadside, head low, shoulders rolling forward with each deliberate step. The lead wolf hesitated, its lips curling back to show teeth, but the bear's roar came again, louder, closer, an unbroken wall of sound that made even Evan's skin prickle. The second wolf bolted first, melting back into the darkness. The third followed, and then the leader, backing toward the trees before vanishing into the black. The bear stood at the center of the clearing for several long moments, chest heaving, ears pivoting toward the retreating sounds. Only when the night fell silent again did she turn her head toward the cabin. Evan lowered the rifle, his breath finally easing. "You came back," he murmured. She didn't move closer, just lingered there, as if making sure the threat had passed. Then she padded toward the river, disappearing down the slope without a sound. Inside, Mara was sitting forward in her chair, eyes wide. "That was?" "Yeah," Evan said, setting the rifle aside. "That was her. She chased them off, didn't she?" He nodded. "If she hadn't been here?" Mara swallowed, glancing toward the door. "Why is she doing this?" Evan leaned against the table, thinking. Could be she remembers. Animals don't forget the ones who hurt them or the ones who don't. Mara wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. Then maybe she knows what it's like to be hunted. Evan didn't answer, but her words stayed with him. The rest of the night passed without another sound. Even the wind seemed to settle, as if the forest had exhaled after the confrontation. When dawn broke, Evan stepped out again to check the ground. The wolves' tracks were fresh, deep from the wet soil, but they stopped abruptly at the line where the bear had stood. The rest of the clearing was untouched. Back inside, Mara was sipping the tea he'd left for her. She looked better, less pale, her voice steadier. "You're thinking about leaving soon," she said. "We'll give it one more day," he replied. "Make sure they're not still circling." "And if they are?" Evan glanced toward the trees. "Then I'm counting on her to let me know." That day passed slowly. Mara rested, while Evan spent hours stacking firewood, repairing the shed door, and walking the perimeter of the clearing. He saw no sign of the wolves, but every so often he thought he caught a flicker of brown fur among the trees. By evening, a calm had settled over the cabin again. They ate a quiet meal, soup from the pot and bread Evan had baked earlier in the week. The sun dipped low, setting the sky in streaks of orange and rose. It was then, just as the first stars came out, that Mara spoke again. "When we get to town, what do we tell people?" Evan considered. "About the wolves? About her?" He set his spoon down. "We tell them the truth. That she wasn't here to hurt anyone." Mara smiled faintly. "They'll think we're crazy." Evan shrugged. "Let em." The morning after the wolves retreated, the forest felt alive in a different way. The air was crisp, the river brighter under the angled sun, and even the breeze carried a gentler tone through the pines. Evan stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching mist drift lazily off the water. Mara stepped outside, leaning on the doorframe. "I think I can make the walk today," she said. Evan studied her. The swelling in her ankle had gone down, though she still favored it when she moved. "It's a long way to town." "You sure?" She nodded. "I don't want to stay here another night in case those wolves come back." "They won't. Not while she's around." At that, Mara tilted her head. "You think she's still close?" "I know she is," Evan said. He didn't explain how he knew, the same way you just feel someone watching when they mean no harm. They packed light, leaving most of the supplies behind for Evan to collect later. He lashed a small pack to his shoulders and took Mara's arm to steady her as they descended toward the river. The current was calm, the surface dappled with sunlight filtering through the high canopy. Evan untied the boat, helped Mara in, and pushed off. The oars dipped and rose with a steady rhythm, cutting their way downstream. Halfway to the bend, Mara's eyes widened. "Evan, look." On the far bank, moving parallel to them through the trees, was the bear. She kept pace easily, her head swinging side to side as she scanned the woods ahead. Every so often, she'd disappear behind a screen of brush, only to reappear further along. Mara's voice dropped. "She's escorting us." Evan said nothing, just kept rowing, though his chest tightened at the truth of it. The bear stayed with them until the bend, where the river widened and the current picked up. She stopped there, standing at the water's edge. Her breath steamed in the cool air, ears pivoting toward the boat. Evan let the current carry them past. For a moment, he thought she'd turn back. But then she stepped into the river. The water rose around her legs, then her chest. She moved forward with powerful strokes, not hurried but deliberate, until she was nearly parallel with the boat again. The current tugged at her fur, sending ripples fanning out in her wake. "Why is she following all the way?" Mara asked softly. Evan kept his eyes on the water ahead. "Because she's not done yet." They reached the next landing point, a gravel bar where the forest road began its long, winding climb toward town. Evan guided the boat to shore and steadied it while Mara stepped out. The bear emerged from the opposite side, water streaming off her coat. She shook once, sending a spray into the sunlight, then moved up the bank to stand a few paces from them. Evan set his pack down and faced her. "This is as far as you need to go," he said quietly. The bear's dark eyes met his. There was no growl, no movement toward them, only a strange stillness, as if she were memorizing the moment. Then her gaze shifted past them, up toward the tree line on the road ahead. Evan turned to see what she was looking at, and froze. Two wolves stood at the edge of the road, their fur bristling in the light breeze. Not the same three from the other night, smaller, leaner, but their eyes carried the same hungry intent. The bear moved before Evan could react, charging up the slope with a guttural roar that split the air. The wolves scattered instantly, vanishing into the underbrush. She didn't pursue far, just enough to drive them deep into the woods. When she returned to the gravel bar, her breathing was deep but controlled. She gave Evan and Mara one last, long look, then turned and loped back toward the riverbank. Mara's voice trembled. She made sure we were safe." Evan nodded. "All the way." They watched as she slipped back into the trees, her brown coat blending with the shadows until she was gone. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Mara said, "You weren't wrong. She's still paying you back." Evan shouldered his pack. "It's not about debt anymore." They began the slow climb up the road, the sounds of the river fading behind them. The forest ahead was quiet, not with the hush of danger, but the kind of quiet that came after something had been set right. By the time they reached the first rise, Evan glanced back one last time. No sign of her, just the shimmer of water through the trees. But he knew she was there, somewhere in the wild beyond, keeping her own pace now. The forest road felt longer than Evan remembered. Each bend revealed another stretch of dirt climbing between tall pines, the scent of resin thick in the cool morning air. Mara moved slowly, her limp pronounced but steady, and Evan matched her pace without complaint. By late morning, the trees thinned, and the hum of distant traffic reached them, faint at first, then growing clearer. A mile later, the road opened onto the outskirts of town, a scattering of houses, the small gas station with its lone pump, and beyond that, the diner where Evan knew they could get Mara warm food and a seat that wasn't a tree stump. As they stepped onto the main street, a few locals turned to look. It wasn't unusual to see hikers coming down from the ridge, but Mara's appearance, mud-stained clothes, a limp, and a guarded expression, drew attention. Inside the diner, the smell of coffee and frying bacon wrapped around them like a blanket. Evan guided Mara to a corner booth, then ordered her a plate of eggs and toast. The waitress, a woman named June who'd known Evan since boyhood, leaned against the counter. "What happened?" she asked, eyeing Mara's ankle. "Got turned around up in the ridge," Evan said. "Twisted her ankle." "That all?" June's eyes narrowed. Evan hesitated. He could feel Mara watching him, waiting to see how much he'd say. "Wolves," he admitted finally. "More than one." June's brows rose. "Haven't heard of a pack that bold in years." "They were close," Evan said. "Closer than they should have been." June glanced at Mara. "You're lucky he found you." Mara's lips curved faintly. "We were both lucky." After the meal, they crossed the street to the small clinic, where the nurse cleaned and wrapped Mara's ankle, pronouncing it a severe sprain but nothing broken. "You'll be off it for a while," she warned. When they left the clinic, Mara paused on the sidewalk. "We're not telling them about her, are we?" Evan shook his head. If word gets out there's a bear guarding people in the ridge, someone will decide she's dangerous. Or try to capture her. Or worse. She's safer if no one knows, Mara said quietly. That's the idea. They walked to the general store, where Evan bought a few supplies for the trip back to his cabin. He intended to return within a couple of days to retrieve what they'd left behind, and to see if the bear was still in the area. Mara lingered near the shelves of canned goods. Do you think she'll be there when you go back? Evan's jaw tightened. If she wants to be. They stepped back outside into the midday sun. A pickup truck rumbled past, the driver giving a wave. Evan lifted a hand in return but kept walking. By the time they reached the small motel at the edge of town, Mara was moving slower, the day's walk catching up to her. He helped her check in, carrying her bag to the room. At the door, she turned to him. You're going back tomorrow, aren't you? Day after, Evan said. Want to give things time to settle. Mara searched his face. If you see her, tell her I'm grateful. Evan gave a small nod. I think she already knows. That night, he stayed in town, taking the room next to hers. Sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept circling back to the bear, the way she'd appeared at the fishing spot, the unbroken watch she'd kept, and that last look before disappearing into the trees. At dawn, he stepped outside, the street quiet under the pale light. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the river would be catching the same sun, and maybe, just maybe, she'd be there, scanning the water for the boat that wasn't coming today. 2 days later, Evan was back on the ridge road, the pickup's tires crunching over gravel. The town had already shifted back into its rhythm, the brief interest in Mara's rescue fading into other news. But for Evan, there'd been no forgetting. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of cedar and cold river water. He parked at the trailhead, shouldered his pack, and started down toward the river. The path was familiar, each bend and rise tied to memories of fishing trips and quiet afternoons, but now it felt different, like stepping into a place that had been changed by what it had witnessed. At the first bend where he could see the water, he stopped. The current was high, sunlight dancing across the ripples, and on the far bank, nothing. No movement in the trees. He followed the river upstream toward the gravel bar where he and Mara had parted ways with the bear. The stones were damp from last night's rain, and the air hummed with the low rush of water. He scanned the treeline, looking for any sign, a shadow, a ripple of fur. Nothing. He exhaled slowly, setting his pack down. Maybe she'd moved deeper into the wilderness. Bears followed their own patterns, they came and went as they pleased. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that she knew he was here. He crossed at the shallows, the cold biting at his calves, and climbed the opposite bank. The ground here was softer, a patchwork of moss and black soil. That's when he saw them, tracks. Fresh ones. Wide pads pressed deep into the mud, claws marking ahead. They led away from the water, angling toward the ridge. Evan followed. The trail wound between spruce and hemlock, the canopy breaking every so often to spill light across the forest floor. The tracks never faltered, moving in a steady, unhurried line. After a mile, they led him to a small rise overlooking a meadow. He stopped at the crest, scanning the open ground. She was there. The bear stood near the far edge, her fur catching the late morning light. She was digging at a rotted log, probably after grubs, but after a moment, her head lifted. Her dark eyes fixed on him across the distance. Evan didn't move. He just stood there, letting the quiet settle between them. She huffed once, a low, almost conversational sound, then returned to the log. She wasn't inviting him closer, but she wasn't leaving either. He found a fallen tree to sit on, resting his elbows on his knees. For the next hour, he watched her move through the meadow, turning over stones, sniffing the air, occasionally glancing his way. It wasn't the same as those tense days by the cabin, but there was still a thread between them. Not obligation, not fear, just recognition. When she finally moved toward the tree-line, Evan stood. She stopped once, halfway into the shade, and looked back at him. He gave a small nod. "Take care of yourself out here." Then she was gone, her shape melting into the dense green. The walk back to the truck felt lighter somehow. Not because he thought he'd never see her again, but because he understood now she didn't belong to him, or to any story that could be fully told. She belonged to this place, to the river and the trees, and to whatever wild purpose had brought her to him that day on the water. By the time he reached the trailhead, the sun was high, and the sound of the river was just a faint murmur behind him. He knew he'd come back here again, maybe many times, and each time he'd glance at the shadows between the pines, wondering if she was there. And maybe, if she wanted, she'd step into the open again. Not to guard, not to repay, but simply to remind him, some bonds don't need words.